bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome, everybody, to Society and the State. Connor flying solo and joined by a special guest that I've had the opportunity to work with on changing a law that, honestly, so many people were like, why do we need a law about that? We're talking about the right and the ability of medical providers to perform pelvic examinations and require that they have consent. We are joined by Robin Fretwell Wilson. She is a professor of law at the University of Illinois College of Law. Professor Wilson, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, it's a privilege. Thank you.
So I first encountered you, as you may recall, in an article we will link to on our show notes page for today for our listeners, which is societyandthestate.com/144. And this was an article in the Deseret News talking about pelvic examinations. In fact, it was my wife who came across this article in her circles, and she was so enraged by it because this article was talking about this controversy of especially women having pelvic examinations performed on them without their knowledge or consent. Help our listeners first understand what in the world is going on here. Why is this practice taking place?
Well, I mean, naturally, we do need, to teach medical students how to, find and identify and diagnose abnormalities. So usually reproductive abnormalities that women have. So that's all to the good, right? We obviously want people to be trained. The real question is, should we respect women enough to ask them if they would be willing, to be used for training purposes while they are in the hospital having surgery? And, your wife's impulses, I think, are very much where mine and many people's are, which is like, why in the world are we not asking?
Now, what is the argument to not ask? In the Deseret News article in particular, it made mention of an opinion piece in the Journal of Healthcare Law and Policy about a decade and a half ago, 2005. And there was a doctor, OBGYN and associate professor at Emory University School of Medicine, who was saying that, these pelvic exams are an important teaching tool, and noted, the article says, a significant divide between the public and the medical community, both in understanding what consent forms authorize and also in the significance of the pelvic exam. And she said, and this is a quote from her, "Do we want the sexual mores of society to place restraints on the ability of physicians to care for the whole patient? More germane to this discussion," she continues, "do we want medical students to graduate less prepared to assess the female reproductive system than the rest of the patient?" So is it that this fear is like, if we have to ask women for consent, they may say no, and therefore let's just, not really have explicit consent so that we can get our students the practice they need?
I think that's, in a nutshell, basically the concern. I mean, Dr. Gedkin, who's the author that you are referencing, is a very thoughtful lady. She's been a medical educator for a very long time. The symposium that she appears in is one that I put together when I was at the University of Maryland. And I have deep, deep, deep respect for her. But if you listen to those claims, Connor, they rest on a single point. Women will not consent if asked. And yet we know that the evidence is to the contrary, that women consent in overwhelming numbers, that there are sufficient numbers of women in the hospital, for fibroids or all kinds of things that they need to have done, and that we need medical students to completely understand. She's right about that. But they're there in such sufficient numbers and will consent that there's no reason to believe that the engine of education shuts down. And I think, it's funny, I was saying to someone this morning, I would no more take out my own appendix as a lawyer, right? Shouldn't be doing that. I think that one of the fundamental problems here is that there are blanket consent forms and that the physicians just sort of read through those at a clip and think, oh, yeah, whatever I'm doing with these medical students is actually consented to. But if you take a fine sort of blow-by-blow lawyerly reading of most consent forms at admissions, they say things like, I consent to you and your team, which might or might not include medical students, depending on how you read that, to do things for my care. Well, if the exam is a second, a third, a fourth exam that's being done by the medical students, that second, third, and fourth exam were not for the patient's care, period. It's not consented to. So we've got like a whole bundle of things operating against just doing the decent and right thing, which is asking women and giving them, the ability to say yes or no.
And not this kind
that
of...
is the way premise of informed consent. I'm sorry, I should also say that, right? Like, it is the premise that, we have the autonomy to decide, all people, all patients have the autonomy to decide what procedures they'll have and which ones they won't.
And I think that's just it, right? Is the argument on the other side is not necessarily that they don't have consent. It's just that, they consented when they came in and signed the broad general consent form, right? This kind of abstract, like, you'll let us do whatever we think is best kind of thing, rather than just being upfront with them and saying, hey, we'd like to have these 7 medical students, gain some experience doing a pelvic exam on you. Are you okay with that, right? Like, isn't it really just this abstract notion of consent versus explicit consent?
Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, I'd be a little bit more technical and lawyerly and say, if what's consented to is for the patient's benefit, it by definition cannot authorize those things that students are doing for their benefit. Mm-hmm. But beyond, let's just say it was under this umbrella. I think it fundamentally disrespects people to lead them to believe that a student is going to be in the room. It's a whole nother thing for that student to be doing a second, a third, a fourth exam on you while you're under anesthesia. Now, many, many people will be like, hey, yeah, that's all good. I don't mind. I'm unconscious. It's not a thing. But you can imagine how triggering it would be for someone who is a sexual assault survivor, just wasn't there for that purpose, did not want to be there for that purpose. And I think, we have to respect the agency of all patients to decide when they're going to be used for this extra collateral additional thing when they're in the hospital to have, their personal needs met.
Now, this isn't just any hospital, right? Traditionally, these are more the teaching hospitals, but help our listeners understand why they may or may not know whether the hospital they're in is a teaching hospital.
Well, I mean, we have studies that suggest that lots of patients, one study of elderly patients that were in teaching hospitals, 60% of them had no idea, didn't even really know what a teaching hospital was. I mean, they tend to be the larger facilities, the things the University of Utah Medical Center, right? But not only. So with the rise of what are called community hospitals, you can have a hospital that's 100 miles away from the medical school that it's associated with. And it's a teaching facility for that medical school, meaning that there are medical students on the premises that may be training, which, for purposes of this conversation means that they may be doing intimate exams for their training benefit while you're there at the hospital. And that's why Utah now says, well, you need to just, be above board about that and ask people. That's, I think, what the Utah law at the end of the day is the proposition that it really stands for. The other part about teaching hospitals isn't just that you might not know that you're in one. You may not have any choice but to be in one. Mm-hmm. So think about the way that insurance networks are put together. The teaching hospitals are going to be, very attractive as partners because they have incredible depth. We would want we would want them to be in the insurance network. But I may just be picking something that's in network because I get a better, reimbursement rate from my insurer and a lower copay, right?
Yeah.
I may not be because I'm like, hey, yeah, if you want to do this, go right ahead. So this idea of impliedly consenting, which is underneath the question of whether you really understand that you're a teaching hospital, I think is a deeply problematic one.
There's an article we will also link to at societyandthestate.com/144 that I want to get your take on. This is talking about the broader landscape of legal reform. In it, It shares the story of Savannah Harshbarger. She's a medical student at Duke University, and it says that she performed as many as 10 pelvic examinations last year on patients before gynecological surgeries, feeling for fibroid tumors or other abnormalities. What was not always clear to her, she indicates, was whether the patients had agreed ahead of time to have a student do that exam while they were under anesthesia. She just walks in and there's this, woman on the operating table or the examination table, and she's, instructed to do her exam. The consent form, she indicated, and this is a quote from her, definitely does not mention any specific things a student might be doing. It's fairly vague language. And so you and I had the opportunity to work together on changing the law in Utah. This passed earlier this year. We helped draft this. Senator McKay ended up sponsoring it. And I'll tell you, no one wanted to vote against that thing, right? When we were saying that just get explicit consent and here's the parameters and, here's how big the font needs to be very clear to the patient. This is what's happening. They want to do an examination on you. Let's be upfront about it. At the end of the day, we were just saying, look, your body, your choice to give consent or not, that thing sailed through unanimously. Put us in a little bit of broader national context. What's happening around the country is how many states would you say have, decent laws on the books, and what's the trend? Are there other states like Utah that are coming on board?
Oh, it's a great question, Connor. It's funny, I talked to Savannah this morning. We just had a conference call before you and I spoke.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and, she, just to fill in a little bit more detail on that point that she made about the consent form, she said that she's been in the room where the patient is told, medical students are going to be here. Well, be here and do pelvic exams are two different things.
Very
right?
different.
So I think we're kind of like soft-pedaling some of this, even when we're saying we're a teaching hospital, we teach, students will be here. But be here and what they explicitly are going to do are two different things. So kudos to Utah for being, just above board and frank about, the need to train and asking patients, to be partners in that. I think that respects them fundamentally. And we've seen the same thing. Of course, Utah has led, but we've had a dozen states since January 1, lawmakers in a dozen states introduced legislation to require that people ask specifically. And Utah, as I said a second ago, and led when the governor signed the law into law. And then last week, the governor of Maryland also signed a similar law. So now we've had 2 of the 12 moves. Now, some of the states are hitting headwinds. And so there was a group of Yale University professors who pushed back against an attempt in Connecticut to require explicit consent, with the claim basically being, it's just not a thing. We don't think it happens here, or we're always asking. And I think one of the things I took out of the conversation with Savannah today is that she said, we're in every room. We're the medical students are there before the attending and the residents sometimes show up. And so we do hear these conversations. We do hear what precisely is being said to patients.
Mm-hmm.
And some of it is very much a soft pedaling, a real downplaying of the role that they may have. Now, I don't know about Yale. I haven't gone back to the Yale University professors in the last couple of weeks, so I just haven't had time. But, if Yale is like other places, it may be that, they're just telling people that they're in teaching hospitals, but not really sort of drilling down on, when it comes to a gynecological surgery, what does that mean? What precisely does that mean? And I must say one more thing about that. You might remember I hope you'll link to, by the way, the Chicago Tribune op-ed that I did in November with a co-author.
We will.
But this is a woman who called me from Arizona. And she had seen the work that I had done in prior states. So there were 6 states before Utah that required specific consent, including Hawaii and Virginia, which were states that I had done a significant amount of work in with others. And she says, I was in the hospital in Arizona, and nobody asked me, but medical students did pelvic exams on me. And she was a sexual assault survivor. So for her, it has been a deeply, deeply devastating thing to learn. I think just from my conversations with her, that if she had been asked, she would have just said no, that it's not for her and wouldn't have been the thing that she wanted to have done.
Sure.
And weirdly, she was there for stomach surgery, Connor. Stomach surgery. That's
Nothing to do with the pelvic area.
Nothing. There's a lot of distance between the stomach and the rest of that. And so imagine her surprise. Now, that's today, right? This was November, or, well, it was in the months before November, but, the story was published in November. So, this is a contemporaneous account.
Yeah.
Somewhere we've got, like, a deep disconnect on facts, because you've got medical students like Savannah saying, yeah, I've done 10 of these, and I've been present in the room when I've heard what's being said about them.
Right.
Have patients who, for the first time, are coming forward, not least of which is Ashley Bates, who in Utah talked about her own experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think she has been a hero, frankly, to share such an intimate encounter, and to say, no one asked me, I woke up screaming, she said in her testimony.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got doctors on one side either sort of saying it's a great big nothing burger, or it doesn't happen, or we kind of ask, but they're not really telling you how above board, and which way precisely did they ask, because I think that matters. And then you've got people saying, you shouldn't have done this with me. You didn't ask me. And, if this isn't happening, a law like the one that Utah passed won't harm anything, will it?
Right? Yep. Yeah, I got to tell you, when my wife reached out to send me that article, because, she's reading this thing and thinking, this is an injustice and there ought to be a law. And she's, married to a guy who changes laws for a living. And so sends it over to me and says, Connor, I got something for you. Go do this. And what she was expressing to me, and what I was seeing a little bit myself, was this, in particular in Utah, this Deseret News article we're going to link to, had gone viral in like female circles, Me Too circles, sexual abuse survivor circles. There were a lot of these different kind of online communities that were getting really fired up because no one had really been aware. And I think really the crux of the matter here is, in fact, I heard female legislators expressing this to me, like, this is crazy. How do I know if it's ever happened to me? Now I'm in fear that, this one time I went under for this operation, that there were some medical students fishing around down there without my knowledge or without my consent. And it's just kind of this like fear of the unknown. And yet on the other hand, like seeing that bill pass unanimously, seeing these other states doing it now, while there are pockets of resistance, I can't imagine that there's going to be any long-term resistance to finally succeed in saying across the board, period, end of story, get consent. You yourself have been a crusader for that. Are you hopeful for that kind of end conclusion? Is that the idea here, is that, every state needs a strong law in the books? Is that what you're working towards?
Yeah, I just can't see why we can't get to that. I mean, this seems like the lowest hanging fruit, right? You ask people permission. It's not so complicated. But, I have to say that the letter from the Yale professors took me back, right? It suggests that, that there's kind of a blue line. Like, people are going to want to say you're questioning our authority, and who are you to do that? I don't know. But, I think if courageous lawmakers step forward and they put this question to the people, I think people will just say there's really no reason not to ask. I think
that's exactly right. Robin Fretwell Wilson, professor of law, University of Illinois College of Law. We'll link to her op-ed in addition to the other articles mentioned. societyandthestate.com/144 is where you can find those. If you, dear listener, are in one of the states not mentioned, there's some work to do. So reach out. Here's a potential project for you to work on. Talk to your lawmaker, find a sponsor, reach out to Professor Wilson. She's very easy to find online. And let's try and get some other states doing this. Professor Wilson, thank you for taking a few minutes to join us on Society and the State.
Absolutely. And hey, Connor, thank you for your leadership. I mean, and your wife and the senator. I just think it's been really, it's just been a wonderful thing to watch, to see Utah stake out the lead on this. I think it's terrific.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.